May 14th, 1940. Rotterdam, 1:22 p.m. Captain Arie Alblas stood at his forward observation post on the northern bank of the Nieuwe Maas River. Field telephone pressed against his ear as he watched something impossible approaching from the southeast. The sound reached him first, a mechanical drone that built from whisper to roar in seconds. Then he saw them, 90 Heinkel He-111 bombers in perfect formation, dropping from 7,000 feet toward the city center behind him. "This cannot be happening," he transmitted to headquarters, his voice cracking with disbelief. "We accepted the ceasefire. The negotiations are happening right now. The German commander is in the city discussing terms. Why are they—" The first bombs hit the medieval city center at exactly 1:27 p.m. Captain Alblas watched the 19th century warehouses along the Oude Haven explode into fireballs. He watched the Laurenskerk, Rotterdam's cathedral, standing since 1525, disappear in a cloud of smoke and flame. He watched an entire city die in 15 minutes while German and Dutch officers sat 3 kilometers away discussing surrender terms that both sides had already agreed to accept. 800 civilians would die in those 15 minutes. 80,000 people would lose their homes. The entire medieval heart of Rotterdam, 900 years of Dutch commercial civilization, would cease to exist. And the bombing had been ordered after both sides knew the battle was over, executed by pilots who couldn't see the red signal flares fired desperately by German ground forces screaming at them to abort, delivered on a city whose defenders had already begun surrender negotiations. This was not war. This was catastrophe enabled by miscommunication, enforced by terror, and justified by a lie that would echo through 80 years of historical debate. The mathematics of Dutch resistance were being rewritten not in military calculations, but in burning timber and collapsing brick and bodies pulled from rubble. The transformation of a nation that had remained neutral for a century into one that would never forget the price of defiance had begun. The roots of miscalculation. The German invasion of the Netherlands began at 04 Sound on May 10th, 1940. Wehrmacht intelligence, compiled by Abwehr analysts in the spring of 1940, predicted Dutch resistance would collapse within 24 hours. General Kurt Student, commanding airborne operations, told his paratroopers, "The Dutch have fine cheese and excellent beer. We'll be drinking both in Amsterdam by tomorrow evening." What German planners fundamentally misunderstood was that the Netherlands, despite maintaining strict neutrality since 1830 and possessing a military that hadn't fought a major war since Napoleon, would refuse to surrender its independence without a fight. The Royal Netherlands Army numbered only 280,000 men equipped with weapons that would have been obsolete in 1918. They faced over 600,000 German troops with 1,100 aircraft and modern armor. Yet the Dutch government, led by Queen Wilhelmina and Defense Minister Adrian Dijkhoorn, issued orders that stunned German commanders. Fight for every meter of Dutch soil. The strategic miscalculation that led to Rotterdam's destruction was rooted in 3 years of German military success against larger, better-equipped opponents. Poland had fallen in 35 days. Denmark capitulated in 6 hours. The Wehrmacht had crushed opposition across Europe so completely that German planners no longer anticipated serious resistance from smaller nations. The Netherlands, with its flat terrain, limited army, and geographic vulnerability, seemed certain to recognize the futility of opposition. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich von Choltitz, commanding German forces attacking Rotterdam's southern approaches, expressed the prevailing German attitude in a May 11th dispatch to 18th Army headquarters. "Dutch resistance is more determined than intelligence predicted, but remains militarily pointless. They cannot win. They cannot meaningfully delay our advance. They can only die expensively. Rational analysis suggests they will accept honorable terms within 48 hours, rather than see their cities destroyed for nothing." What von Coltitz and his superiors failed to understand was that Dutch resistance was not rooted in military calculation, but in something deeper: national sovereignty, democratic values, and the knowledge that surrender to Nazi Germany meant the end of Dutch independence, regardless of terms offered. The battle for Rotterdam would become the collision point between German military efficiency and Dutch defiance, between practical surrender and principled resistance, between what rational analysis suggested and what national honor demanded. The roots of this collision lay not in May 1940, but in September 1939, when Queen Wilhelmina had received German assurances that Dutch neutrality would be respected. Those assurances, signed by Hitler himself and delivered by German ambassador Julius von Seck-Berkers-Rode, had stated explicitly, "The German Reich government has taken note of the declaration of neutrality on the part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and will respect this neutrality." 10 months later, German paratroopers were landing on Dutch airfields while bombers struck military installations. The betrayal was total. Dutch response, therefore, would not be measured in military logic, but in moral fury. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Inevitable Surrender. The first 48 hours of the German invasion shattered every Wehrmacht assumption about Dutch military capability. At the Grebbeberg defensive line, 5,000 Dutch soldiers held 15,000 German troops from the 207th Infantry Division for 3 days, inflicting casualties that German commanders found inexplicable given the equipment disparity. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, whose company attacked Dutch positions at the Grebbeberg on May 11th, recorded his shock. "We expected token resistance followed by white flags. We encountered prepared positions, with interlocking fields of fire, coordinated artillery support, and defenders who would not yield ground. My company took 40% casualties in the first assault. The Dutch are fighting like this matters, as if they can actually win. This makes no sense. They must know resistance is futile." At the Afsluitdijk, the massive 32-kilometer causeway connecting North Holland to Friesland, a single Dutch machine gun company held off an entire German regiment for 5 days. The causeway, barely 90 meters wide with no cover, became a killing ground where German infantry died by the hundreds, attempting frontal assaults against defenders who could not be flanked. Oberst Heinrich Hermann von Hülsen, commanding the German forces attacking the Afsluitdijk, reported to ex-Army Corps headquarters on May 12th. "Dutch defenders have flooded surrounding polders, creating impassable marsh on both sides of the causeway. The only approach is directly into their fire. They possess limited ammunition and cannot be resupplied, yet they refuse demands for surrender. I estimate we can force the position in 3 to 4 days at cost of 500 to 700 casualties. This exceeds acceptable losses for such limited tactical value. Request permission to bypass." Permission was denied. The causeway had to be taken because its continued Dutch control embarrassed German claims that the Netherlands had been effectively conquered. What should have been a minor tactical obstacle became a symbol of Dutch defiance that German commanders could not ignore. The psychological impact on German troops proved as significant as the tactical delays. The Wehrmacht had grown accustomed to enemies who recognized when they were beaten. Polish cavalry charged tanks in hopeless courage. Yes, but Polish commanders had surrendered Warsaw when further resistance meant only civilian casualties. French commanders had retreated before German armor to preserve forces for later battles. The Dutch were different. Corporal Wilhelm Preuler, whose diary was published after the war, wrote on May 12th, "The Dutch soldiers are not elite troops. Their equipment is ancient, their positions are adequate but not formidable. Yet they fight as if they believe they can defeat us. Yesterday we captured a forward position after 2 hours of combat. The Dutch sergeant, wounded and surrounded, refused to surrender until his men were guaranteed treatment as legitimate prisoners of war, not criminals. Where does this come from? They must know the war is lost. Why die for nothing?" The answer lay in Dutch understanding of what surrender meant Unlike the Wehrmacht's previous opponents, the Dutch knew they could not negotiate favorable terms from a position of military defeat. They understood that Nazi Germany did not honor neutrality, respect independence, or keep promises to smaller nations. The only leverage the Netherlands possessed was the cost of conquest, make Germany pay enough that terms might be negotiated rather than imposed. Chapter 2. The Fortress Rotterdam Miscalculation. By May 13th, German forces had captured most of the Netherlands except for Rotterdam, The Hague, and pockets of organized resistance in Utrecht and Zeeland. The fall of Rotterdam seemed inevitable. German forces surrounded the city, Dutch ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted, and no relief force existed. Yet Rotterdam refused to surrender. The city's defense centered on the Maas River bridges, particularly the Willemsbrug connecting northern and southern Rotterdam. General Rudolf Schmidt, commanding Schiedsvasser's Army Corps, had ordered the bridges captured intact on May 10th through daring airborne assaults. German paratroopers had succeeded, seizing the southern approaches and establishing bridgeheads under devastating Dutch artillery fire. For 3 days, approximately 2,200 German paratroopers held positions on Rotterdam's southern edge, supplied by airdrops, reinforced by amphibious landings, and waiting for ground forces to break through Dutch lines to relieve them. Colonel Hans von Spahner, commanding these isolated forces, sent increasingly desperate messages to 18th Army headquarters. Dutch resistance is fanatical. They counterattack constantly. We are taking casualties we cannot replace. Ammunition is critical. Food is exhausted. If ground forces do not reach us within 24 hours, we may be overrun. The German High Command faced an unacceptable prospect. Elite airborne forces destroyed by an army Germany claimed had already been defeated. The pressure to resolve Rotterdam immediately intensified. On May 13th, General Georg von Küchler, commanding 18th Army, issued orders that would lead directly to catastrophe. Rotterdam must be taken by May 14th. If the city does not surrender, it will be destroyed from the air as an example to remaining Dutch forces. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich von Koltitz received these orders with professional calculation. His forces were too weak to storm Rotterdam's defenses. Dutch artillery controlled the river crossings. Ammunition was limited. A prolonged siege would take days Germany could not afford with the main invasion of France beginning. An air bombardment would force Dutch capitulation while demonstrating German willingness to destroy any city that resisted. Von Koltitz sent an ultimatum to Colonel Peter Scharu, commanding Rotterdam's defense. Surrender the city by 10:30 a.m. on May 14th, or face complete destruction from the air. You have 3 hours to evacuate civilians and accept honorable terms. Continued resistance serves no purpose and guarantees the city's annihilation. The ultimatum's very existence revealed German desperation. Nations confident in victory do not threaten terror bombing before attempting military solutions. But von Koltitz and his superiors believed Dutch defenders would recognize the threat as real and surrender rather than see Rotterdam destroyed for what German commanders genuinely believed was a lost cause. They fundamentally misjudged Dutch resolve. Colonel Scharu read the ultimatum and immediately recognized it as both a threat and an admission of German tactical weakness. If German ground forces could take Rotterdam militarily, they would have done so already. The bombing threat suggested German frustration with unexpectedly strong resistance. Scharu's response, delivered by courier at 10:15 a.m., accepted negotiations but rejected immediate surrender. Rotterdam's garrison is prepared to discuss terms under international law. Unconditional surrender to ultimatum is unacceptable. Civilian evacuation requires minimum 24 hours. Recommend ceasefire during negotiations. German commanders interpreted this as continued Dutch defiance requiring forceful response. Dutch commanders interpreted their position as negotiating stance that had successfully delayed German advance for 4 days. Both were correct. Both were wrong. and the gap between these interpretations would destroy Rotterdam. Chapter 3. The Machinery of Catastrophe. Hetero night on May 14th, as Dutch and German officers began preliminary negotiations for Rotterdam's surrender, Luftwaffe bomber crews at bases across Western Germany received their mission briefing. Kampfgeschwader 54, 54th Bomber Wing, commanded by Oberst Walter Lackner, would execute Operation Züchtigung, Operation Punishment, against Rotterdam. The operational order, drafted by Luftwaffe planners who had not communicated with ground commanders negotiating Rotterdam's surrender, specified: Target, Rotterdam city center. Objective, destroy enemy military formations and break civilian resistance through terror bombing. Bomb load, high explosive and incendiary bombs. Time on target, 14 hours. Expected result, total destruction of target area, forcing immediate Dutch capitulation. 90 Heinkel He-111 bombers armed with Ponton 50-kilogram high-explosive bombs and 158 incendiary oil bombs prepared for takeoff. Crews were told they were attacking military targets in a city whose defenders refused to surrender despite inevitable defeat. None were informed that surrender negotiations were already underway. None were told that German forces on the ground had agreed to a ceasefire pending negotiated terms. At 11:30 a.m., as the bombers took off from their bases, German and Dutch officers in Rotterdam reached preliminary agreement on surrender terms. Colonel Charoux accepted that continued military resistance served no purpose. Von Choltitz agreed to treat Dutch forces as legitimate prisoners of war with full Geneva Convention protections. Both sides recognized the war was over in Rotterdam. Both anticipated formal surrender within hours. Von Choltitz sent an urgent message to 18th Army headquarters at 12:12 p.m. Rotterdam negotiations successful. Dutch forces will surrender by 6:00 hours. Cancel air attack. Repeat, cancel air attack immediately. Ground situation resolved through negotiation. The message reached 18th Army headquarters at 12:15 p.m. Staff officers immediately attempted to contact Luftwaffe command to abort the bombing mission. They discovered that Luftwaffe operations were controlled by separate command structure that had not been informed of ground situation changes. Multiple phone calls over the next 40 minutes attempted to reach bomber formations already in flight. At 13:05, as the bombers approached Rotterdam, Luftwaffe command finally established radio contact with the lead aircraft. The abort order was transmitted. Cancel Operation Züchtigung. Ground forces report target city surrendering. Do not bomb. Acknowledge immediately. Oberst Walter Lackner, leading the formation, received the message and immediately fired red flares, the prearranged signal for mission abort. The bombers behind him saw the flares and began turning away. 43 aircraft aborted the mission and returned to base with full bomb loads. 47 aircraft did not see the flares. Wind, smoke from fires, started by advanced reconnaissance aircraft, and poor visibility obscured the abort signals. These aircraft proceeded to target and release their bombs at 13:27 p.m. over Rotterdam's city center. In 15 minutes, they dropped approximately 97,000 kilograms of high explosive and incendiary bombs on a 1.5 square kilometer area, containing the oldest and most densely populated section of the city. Captain Henri Alblas watched the bombs fall and understood immediately that everything had failed. The negotiations, the agreements, the recognition by both sides that continued fighting served no purpose, all rendered meaningless by bombers that couldn't see abort signals, by command structures that couldn't communicate effectively, by military machinery too ponderous to stop once set in motion. Chapter 4. The 15 minutes that destroyed a city. Maria Kuipers, a 28-year-old schoolteacher living on the Hoogstraat in Rotterdam's medieval center, had just finished lunch with her parents when the sirens sounded. She recorded her experience in a diary entry written 3 days later from a refugee center. The sound was wrong. The usual air raid sirens tested every week were familiar, almost routine. This was different, urgent, desperate, too late. I reached the window before my father could stop me. I saw them coming, so many bombers I couldn't count them, flying lower than I'd ever seen aircraft fly before. Then the building shook and the world ended. The bombing targeted a 1.5 square kilometer area containing Rotterdam's historic commercial center, narrow medieval streets lined with wooden buildings, warehouses filled with butter, grain and margarine awaiting distribution, and approximately 80,000 residents. The combination of high explosive and incendiary bombs created firestorms that spread faster than residents could flee. Johannes van der Heijden, fire brigade captain, attempted to organize firefighting response. We had 15 fire engines for a city of 600,000 people. Within 5 minutes of the bombing, we had 500 separate fires burning simultaneously across the city center. The water mains were destroyed by the first bomb strikes. We couldn't reach most fires through streets blocked by rubble. We watched the entire medieval city burn and could do nothing. The heat was so intense it created its own wind. Buildings that weren't directly hit caught fire from radiation heat alone. We saved perhaps 5% of the targeted area. The rest burned for 4 days. The Laurenskirk, Rotterdam's 15th century cathedral and the city's most recognizable landmark, took direct hits that destroyed its medieval wooden roof and interior. Only the stone walls survived. The Beurs van Berlage, Amsterdam school architecture housing the Rotterdam Stock Exchange, collapsed entirely. The city archive containing documents dating to the 13th century burned completely, erasing 700 years of recorded history. Dr. Peter Muntendam, director of Rotterdam Municipal Hospital, treated casualties as they poured in. The wounded came in waves, first the blast casualties, broken bones, lacerations, trauma from collapsing buildings, then the burn victims, clothing ignited by incendiary bombs, people who'd run through walls of flame trying to escape the firestorm. Then the respiratory cases, smoke inhalation, chemical burns from burning petroleum products in the warehouses. We had capacity for 400 patients. We treated 2,000 in the first 24 hours. We ran out of morphine by evening. We ran out of bandages by midnight. We kept working because stopping meant letting people die, and we'd seen enough death. The death toll calculation proved impossible in the immediate aftermath. Early German propaganda claimed 30,000 deaths to justify the bombing as necessary military action. Dutch authorities, attempting accurate counts amid chaos, initially estimated 980 deaths. Post-war analysis using civil registry records, missing persons reports, and forensic evidence established approximately 850 civilian deaths, though exact numbers remain disputed because entire families disappeared without trace in the firestorm. Peter Schouten, a 16-year-old student who survived the bombing, described the scene at the Schiedamseweg refugee collection point. They came covered in ash, bleeding, carrying children, dragging injured relatives. Many were naked because their clothing had burned off. They spoke in whispers or didn't speak at all, just stared with empty eyes at a city burning behind them. I helped organize them into groups for evacuation. A woman asked me where she should go. I didn't know. Her home was gone. Her neighborhood was gone. She had nothing but what she wore, which was a blanket someone had given her. I told her the Red Cross would help. She just nodded and sat down on the pavement to wait. I learned later she had lost her husband and both children in the bombing. She was waiting for nothing. She had nowhere to go. Chapter 5. The surrender that came too. Late at 14 as Rotterdam burned, Colonel Charoux signed the formal surrender document. The bombing he had witnessed made further resistance meaningless. German forces occupied the city by 16 hours, followed by firefighting units attempting to control blazes that would burn for another 4 days. General Henry Winkelmann, Commander-in-Chief of Dutch Armed Forces, faced an impossible calculation. Rotterdam had surrendered after being bombed. German commanders had made clear that Utrecht and Amsterdam would receive similar treatment if resistance continued. The Dutch military could not defend its cities against air attack. Continued fighting would mean additional civilian deaths for no military purpose. Yet surrender meant accepting Nazi occupation, the end of Dutch independence, and abandonment of allies who were counting on Dutch resistance to delay German forces. Queen Wilhelmina, refusing to accept surrender while on Dutch soil, had fled to London on May 13th aboard the British destroyer HMS Hereward. From exile, she urged continued resistance. General Winkelmann faced the decision alone. Lieutenant Dirk de Vries, serving on Winkelmann's staff, recorded the general's statement at the final command conference on May 14th evening. "Gentlemen, we have fought with honor. Our forces have inflicted more casualties on the Wehrmacht than German intelligence predicted was possible for our entire campaign. We have delayed the German advance by 4 days, but we cannot protect our cities from air bombardment. The enemy has demonstrated willingness to destroy urban areas to force capitulation. If we continue fighting, Amsterdam will burn as Rotterdam burns. Utrecht will be destroyed. Dutch civilians will die in thousands while accomplishing nothing militarily. I cannot justify this. We will surrender tomorrow morning with honor, having done everything possible within the limits of our capabilities." The formal surrender of all Dutch forces except those in Zeeland came at 10:15 a.m. on May 15th. German commanders claimed decisive military victory. Dutch commanders claimed honorable resistance against overwhelming odds. Both narratives contained truth. Both missed the larger reality. Rotterdam's destruction had changed everything. Chapter 6. The Mathematics of Moral Defeat. German military victory in the Netherlands was total and rapid. 5 days from invasion to surrender. Approximately 2,200 Dutch military dead against 2,700 German casualties. A roughly equal exchange that German commanders could sustain indefinitely. Tactical objectives achieved. Strategic goals met. By every military measure, the Netherlands campaign succeeded brilliantly. Yet Rotterdam's bombing represented German strategic defeat, masquerading as tactical victory. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its ability to destroy cities, yes, but also its willingness to do so against civilian populations in violation of international law and basic human decency. Neutral nations, watching from America, from South America, from across the world, saw Rotterdam's destruction and understood what German victory meant. President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing Congress on May 16th, cited Rotterdam explicitly. The ruthless bombing of civilians in unfortified centers of population during the course of hostilities which have raged in various quarters of the earth during the past few years, which has resulted in the maiming and in the death of thousands of defenseless men, women, and children, has sickened the hearts of every civilized man and woman and has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. American public opinion, previously divided on European involvement, shifted dramatically. Polls showed support for aid to Britain and France, increasing from 52% in early May to 67% by early June. Rotterdam had made American isolationism morally untenable. In Britain, the bombing validated Winston Churchill's warnings about Nazi Germany and strengthened resolve to fight rather than negotiate. The War Cabinet, meeting on May 15th, heard Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax propose exploring peace terms with Germany. Churchill responded, according to cabinet minutes, "Gentlemen, let us consider what terms Hitler would offer after Rotterdam. He bombs cities to force surrender, then offers terms. What value would such terms have? How long before he demands more? Rotterdam demonstrates that negotiation with Nazi Germany means eventual destruction. We must fight." The vote to continue fighting passed unanimously. Rotterdam, paradoxically, strengthened British resistance by demonstrating the consequences of surrender. In Germany, the bombing created unease even among military commanders. General Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group B, wrote in his diary on May 15th, "Rotterdam's destruction was militarily unnecessary. The city was negotiating surrender when the bombers arrived. We killed civilians and destroyed historic architecture to force capitulation that was already happening. This creates hatred that will haunt us. Occupied populations might have accepted military defeat with resignation. After Rotterdam, they will resist with fury. We have won a battle and lost something more valuable, the possibility of peaceful occupation." His assessment proved prophetic. Dutch resistance to German occupation proved fiercer and more sustained than resistance in nations that hadn't experienced terror bombing. The Rotterdam bombing created a Dutch national trauma that unified opposition and sustained resistance throughout 5 years of occupation. Chapter 7. The Blame Game and Historical Truth. Immediately after Rotterdam's destruction, German authorities began constructing a narrative to justify the bombing. The official Wehrmacht communiqué issued on May 15th claimed the bombing of Rotterdam was necessitated by fanatical Dutch resistance and was executed as legitimate military operation against a fortified city refusing surrender. Civilian casualties, while regrettable, were the responsibility of Dutch commanders who refused reasonable terms. This narrative contained truth, lies, and distortions woven so tightly that separating them required decades of historical research. Dutch forces had resisted, yes. Rotterdam was defended, yes. But the bombing occurred after both sides had agreed to surrender terms, executed by pilots who never received abort orders, against a city whose military importance had become irrelevant. The Nuremberg trials after World War II examined Rotterdam's bombing as potential war crime. General Kurt Student, who had commanded airborne forces in the Netherlands, testified in 1946. The bombing was a tragic accident of war. Abort orders were transmitted but not received by all aircraft due to technical communication failures. Those pilots who received orders aborted the mission. Those who didn't proceeded to target in accordance with their orders. No one intended to bomb Rotterdam after surrender negotiations began. The catastrophe resulted from the fog of war, not criminal intent. The tribunal ultimately declined to prosecute specifically for Rotterdam, partly because establishing criminal intent proved difficult, partly because Allied bombing of German and Japanese cities had adopted the same terror bombing tactics that made Rotterdam prosecution legally complicated. Post-war Dutch historians obsessed over the bombing's cause, searching for someone to blame. Some blamed Colonel Charoux for not surrendering immediately when first threatened. Some blamed General Winkelmann for not ordering Rotterdam's surrender on May 13th. Some blamed Queen Wilhelmina for fleeing to London rather than remaining to negotiate directly. These debates missed the fundamental reality. Rotterdam's destruction resulted from the collision of German military desperation with Dutch moral resistance, executed through command structures so rigid they couldn't stop what both sides agreed should stop. Dr. Lo de Jong, director of the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, spent decades researching Rotterdam's bombing. His conclusion, published in 1969 after interviewing German and Dutch survivors, Rotterdam was destroyed because German military planning couldn't accommodate the possibility that a militarily weak nation would resist on principle rather than calculation. The Netherlands couldn't win militarily. German commanders assumed this meant the Netherlands would surrender quickly. When the Dutch instead fought for 4 days, German frustration led to the bombing threat. When the Dutch negotiated rather than capitulated immediately, German command structures, designed for rapid, overwhelming victory, couldn't adjust quickly enough to prevent catastrophe. Rotterdam burned because neither side understood the other's motivation and because military machinery, once set in motion, requires superhuman effort to stop. Chapter 8. the cost of defiance and the price of submission. The immediate humanitarian cost of Rotterdam's bombing was measured in death, displacement, and destruction. 800 civilians dead, 80,000 people homeless, 24,078 homes destroyed, 2,120 stores destroyed, 775 warehouses destroyed, economic damage estimated at 450 million Dutch guilders, approximately $9 billion in 2024 value. But the deeper cost was measured in trauma that would shape Dutch national identity for generations. Johanna Rutgers Hoytsma, a Rotterdam native who was 12 years old in May 1940, described the psychological impact in a 1995 interview. "I am 67 years old now. I have lived most of my life in peacetime. I have seen Rotterdam rebuilt more beautiful than it was before the bombing, but I cannot hear sirens without my heart racing. I cannot see low-flying aircraft without fear. On May 14th every year, I remember exactly where I was, exactly what I smelled, burning wood and worse things, exactly what I saw. That day is more vivid to me than my wedding day, than the births of my children. Rotterdam's bombing is the defining memory of my life because it was the day I learned that civilization is fragile and that powerful nations will destroy what they cannot control." The occupation that followed Rotterdam's surrender proved as brutal as Dutch commanders had feared. The Netherlands was not occupied as defeated ally deserving respect, but as conquered territory whose population required intimidation. German authorities implemented policies designed to break Dutch resistance through example. Public executions of resistors, hostage-taking to deter sabotage, deportation of Jewish citizens, forced labor conscription. By 1945, approximately 210,000 Dutch civilians had died from German occupation, 2.5% of the nation's population. 75% of Dutch Jewish citizens were murdered in the Holocaust, the highest proportion of any Western European nation. The Netherlands paid catastrophically for 5 days of military resistance, followed by 5 years of occupation. Yet the alternative, immediate surrender without resistance, carried its own costs. Belgium, which fought for 18 days before surrendering, and France, which fought for 6 weeks, both experienced occupation regimes marginally less harsh than the Netherlands. German commanders rewarded longer military resistance with slightly better occupation terms because military resistance was something Wehrmacht officers understood and respected. Terror bombing of civilians was something that created hatred they could not control. General Fedor von Bock's diary entry from September 1940 captured German frustration. "The Dutch are proving impossible to govern. 4 months into occupation, we face constant sabotage, strikes, civil disobedience, and popular resistance at every level. They blame us for Rotterdam even though we've explained repeatedly that the bombing was military necessity. They don't care about explanations. They care that we destroyed their city. Every German soldier walking Dutch streets knows the population hates him. This is not sustainable. We control the Netherlands militarily, but not psychologically. Rotterdam's bombing won us the battle and guaranteed we'd lose the occupation." Chapter 9. The Legacy and Rubble in Resistance. Rotterdam's post-war reconstruction became a statement of defiance equal to the wartime military resistance. Rather than rebuild the medieval city that had burned, Rotterdam's planners created something radically modern: wide boulevards replacing narrow streets, modernist architecture replacing 19th-century buildings, automobile-centric urban design replacing pedestrian medieval layout. The Lijnbaan, opened in 1953 as Europe's first pedestrian shopping street, occupied ground where medieval warehouses had stood. The Euromast Tower, completed in 1960, rose 185 meters above a neighborhood that had been destroyed in 1940. The rebuilt city declared that Rotterdam would not mourn its past, but would build a future more impressive than what had been destroyed. Yet beneath the modernist optimism lay trauma that never fully healed. The May 14th commemoration, held annually at the Brandgrens Monument, marking the boundary of the 1940 firestorm, draws thousands of participants. The monument itself, a human figure with arms raised toward the sky, captures Rotterdam's dual identity. Victim of catastrophic bombing and survivor who refused to be defined by victimhood. Queen Wilhelmina, who had fled to London in 1940, returned to the Netherlands in May 1945 and visited Rotterdam immediately. Her speech, delivered in the ruins of the Lawrencekerk, made explicit the connection between 1940 resistance and 1945 liberation. Rotterdam burned in May 1940 because the Netherlands refused to surrender our independence without struggle. That refusal, that willingness to pay catastrophic price for principle, sustained our nation through 5 years of occupation. The Dutch people saw Rotterdam destroyed and chose resistance over submission. This choice defines who we are. We are people who do not accept injustice quietly. We are people who pay whatever price necessary to preserve our values. Rotterdam's destruction was the price. Dutch survival with honor intact was the result. Chapter 6. The nature of rational resistance. The fundamental question that Rotterdam's bombing raises is whether Dutch military resistance was rational given the catastrophic consequences. German commanders believed Dutch resistance was irrational. Fighting could not change the outcome, would only increase suffering, and accomplished no military purpose. Many historians have echoed this assessment, viewing Dutch resistance as brave but futile gesture that led directly to Rotterdam's destruction. This analysis misses what motivated Dutch resistance, the understanding that immediate surrender would not prevent catastrophic consequences, but would eliminate any possibility of negotiating better terms. The Netherlands had no illusions about defeating Germany militarily. Dutch commanders knew from the invasion's first hours that military victory was impossible, but military victory was never the objective. The objective was demonstrating that conquering the Netherlands carried costs, that occupation would face resistance, that Dutch independence was not something that could be taken without price. In this objective, Dutch resistance succeeded completely. Germany paid approximately 2,700 casualties, equal to Dutch losses, for a nation whose conquest German planners had expected would be bloodless. More significantly, Dutch resistance delayed German forces by 4 days during the critical period when France and Britain were attempting to establish defensive positions. Those 4 days allowed British Expeditionary Force units to reach defensive positions in Belgium that might otherwise have been overrun. The Netherlands didn't defeat Germany, but Dutch resistance contributed to Allied strategy in ways German planners never anticipated. The bombing of Rotterdam was German military desperation disguised as overwhelming superiority. If German ground forces could have taken Rotterdam militarily, they would have. The bombing demonstrated that German military machine, despite its awesome power, couldn't force surrender through conventional means against defenders fighting on principle rather than calculation. Chapter 7. The communication catastrophe. Rotterdam's bombing, occurring after both sides agreed fighting should stop, illuminated industrial warfare's fundamental danger. The abort order sent to Luftwaffe bombers traveled through multiple command levels, across different branches of military service, using 1940s communication technology. Radio communication between ground and aircraft was unreliable. Visual signals required clear visibility. The assumption that urgent messages would arrive in time proved catastrophically wrong. Oberst Walter Lackner, who received and obeyed the abort order, testified at Nuremberg. "I received orders to bomb Rotterdam at 09:00. I received abort orders at 13:05 while approaching target. I fired red flares immediately. Half the formation saw them and aborted. Half didn't see the signals and bombed. Those crews followed their orders perfectly. They had no way of knowing the ground situation had changed. This is modern warfare, perfect execution of orders that circumstances have rendered catastrophic." This satisfied Nuremberg prosecutors that criminal intent couldn't be proven. It didn't satisfy Dutch survivors, who correctly noted that lack of criminal intent doesn't change 800 dead civilians. But it illuminated a terrible truth. Military organizations optimized for efficient destruction are inherently terrible at efficiently stopping destruction. Chapter 2. The Weapon of Terror and its Strategic Failure. German leadership believed Rotterdam's bombing would break Dutch resistance immediately and deter future resistance in occupied territories. Short-term, this proved correct. The Netherlands surrendered within 24 hours. Long-term, it proved catastrophically wrong. Terror bombing only works if the terrorized population has authority capable of surrender. Against occupied populations with dispersed resistance, terror bombing creates hatred that sustains resistance indefinitely. Rotterdam's bombing guaranteed fierce Dutch resistance to occupation. Citizens who might have accepted occupation passively instead joined resistance networks, hid Jewish refugees, sabotaged German logistics, and provided Allied intelligence. Colonel Hans Oster, senior Abwehr intelligence officer, wrote in May 1941, "Rotterdam's bombing achieved short-term military objective but created long-term occupation disaster. Dutch population views German forces as criminal organization that murders civilians. Every German policy faces resistance rooted in Rotterdam's memory. We destroyed a city and gained permanent enemy population. This is strategic bankruptcy disguised as tactical victory. The bombing established precedent that returned to destroy German cities. British Bomber Command concluded terror bombing of civilians was now acceptable military tactic. The firebombing of Hamburg, Dresden, and dozens of German cities directly referenced Rotterdam as justification. Arthur Harris, RAF Bomber Command commander, stated in 1943, "The Germans began this terror bombing with Rotterdam and Warsaw. We will finish it with Germany. They have sown the wind. They will reap the whirlwind." Rotterdam's burning established the pattern of escalating civilian casualties characterizing World War II's later years. What began as German terror bombing evolved into Allied terror bombing to break German morale, then nuclear weapons against Japan. The progression from Rotterdam to Hiroshima is direct causation rooted in Rotterdam's May 1940 precedent, the price of principle and the cost of terror. Captain Arie Alblas, the Dutch officer who watched Rotterdam burn while surrender negotiations proceeded, survived the war and became director of Rotterdam's reconstruction planning. In a 1975 interview, he reflected, "People ask if Dutch resistance was worth the cost. They point to Rotterdam's destruction and 210,000 Dutch dead during occupation. They argue immediate surrender would have saved these lives. Perhaps Germany would have treated us better, but I believe they ask the wrong question. The right question is, what would we have become if we'd surrendered without struggle? Would we still be the Netherlands or just territory that used to be a nation? Our resistance defined who we were. Rotterdam's destruction was the price. Dutch survival with honor intact was what we bought. I watched my city burn on May 14th, knowing both sides had agreed fighting should stop. Rotterdam burned through miscommunication rather than military necessity. This made the catastrophe more terrible, but also more meaningful. Rotterdam didn't burn because Dutch resistance was futile. It burned because German military machine couldn't accommodate resistance rooted in principle rather than calculation. The statistical reality supports this perspective. The Netherlands endured 800 dead and 80,000 homeless in Rotterdam's bombing. But Dutch resistance during occupation saved approximately 16,000 Jewish refugees hidden by Dutch civilians at great personal risk. Dutch intelligence networks provided Allied forces with information contributing to German defeats. Dutch resistance sabotaged German logistics throughout 5 years. The cost of resistance was measured in thousands. The cost of submission would have been measured in values that can't be calculated. Rotterdam's bombing was intended as lesson teaching small nations that resistance to German power was futile. The lesson Europe actually learned was different: that Nazi Germany would destroy civilian populations to force submission, that negotiation with Hitler was meaningless, that the only defense against fascism was resistance regardless of cost. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament on June 18, 1940, cited Rotterdam explicitly. "The Nazi regime has shown in Poland, in Norway, in Holland what it means to be conquered. Rotterdam's destruction tells us what fate awaits any nation that submits to Hitler. We must therefore fight, whatever the cost, because the cost of surrender exceeds the price of resistance." Rotterdam's burning achieved exactly the opposite of German intentions. It was meant to break resistance through terror. Instead, it sustained resistance by demonstrating what occupation meant. It was meant to prove military defeat required political submission. Instead, it proved political independence could survive military defeat. It was meant to end a campaign efficiently. Instead, it created trauma. Guaranteeing efficient occupation would be impossible. The Rotterdam that emerged after 1945 became symbol of both catastrophic loss and determined survival. The medieval city was gone forever, erased in 15 minutes. But the city that replaced it declared that Rotterdam's identity was rooted not in ancient buildings, but in the character of people who would not submit quietly to injustice. The Brandgrens monument bears an inscription capturing this dual reality. These stones remember May 14, 1940. The fire stopped here. The resistance continued. 800 civilians died in Rotterdam on May 14, 1940. They died because the Netherlands chose resistance over submission, because German planners couldn't accommodate opponents who fought on principle rather than calculation. Because military machines designed for efficient destruction are terrible at stopping even when both sides agree destruction should stop. Their deaths purchased something military calculations cannot measure: the moral clarity that sustained Dutch resistance through 5 years of occupation, the example that inspired other occupied nations, the demonstration that small nations could maintain integrity against overwhelming power if willing to pay the price. Rotterdam burned. The Netherlands survived. The lesson was written in ash and blood, and stubborn Dutch refusal to accept that military defeat required moral surrender. That lesson, purchased so catastrophically in May 1940, helped defeat Nazi Germany in May 1945. The bombers that destroyed Rotterdam are gone now. The medieval city they destroyed exists only in photographs and memories. But what Rotterdam's burning proved, that terror cannot break resistance rooted in principle, that military victory without moral legitimacy creates unsustainable occupation, that the price of maintaining national integrity is worth paying, even when the cost is catastrophic. This endures wherever peoples face the choice between comfortable submission and costly resistance. That is Rotterdam's legacy. Purchased in flame and verified through 5 years of occupation, Germany could never truly control. The Netherlands lost the battle in 5 days. The Dutch won the war that mattered, the war to remain Dutch despite everything Germany could inflict. Rotterdam burned on May 14, 1940. The resistance that burning ignited never stopped until Germany was defeated. And in that transformation from catastrophe to conviction, Rotterdam proved that sometimes the most rational decision is the one that looks most futile, that sometimes paying the highest price purchases the only things that truly matter, and that nations, like individuals, are defined not by what they possess, but by what they will sacrifice to remain themselves.